Delighted to see you all here this evening, and I'm sure you all know we're here to celebrate the launch of this fantastic book called Harambee, The Spirit of Innovation in Africa, authored by Mike Bruton, Professor Mike Bruton. My name is Kit Vaughan, and I'm a colleague of Mike's, and I look forward to hosting this event by asking Mike a series of questions, but I also want to give you in the audience an opportunity to ask questions as well. So if something catches your fancy, maybe after one of Mike's answers, please just stick up your hand and I'll recognize you, and then you can go ahead and ask your own question. So let's get going. So Mike Bruton is an emeritus professor of ichthyology. He got a PhD in that subject at Rhodes University, which is also my alma mater. And he ultimately became the professor and head of that department in Grahamstown, and subsequently was also the director of the J.L.B. Smith Institute of Ichthyology. From there, he moved here to Cape Town and was the founding education director of the Two Oceans Oceanarium here in Cape Town. Subsequently was the director of the MTN Science Center, now known as the Cape Town Science Center. And in fact, he took that model and has introduced it to countries all over the world, particularly in the Middle East. And he's spent the last 10 or 15 years writing books in his retirement. And tonight is one of those books that we're going to celebrate. So, Mike, fantastic to be with you this evening.
Thank you, Kit, for doing the interview. I just want to mention I'm really grateful to everyone who's here. It'd be great having a conversation with you, but I'm assured by the live streaming people that there are at least 2 million people watching on live streaming.
Well said. So I particularly appreciate book titles that are somewhat enigmatic, and yours certainly embraces that idea. Explain to us what Harambee means and why you chose that specific word for your title.
All right, well, this is a book about Africa. It's a book about inventions and innovations in Africa. And I wanted the title to have an African flavor. Harambee is a Swahili word. It means let's all pull together, or let's all work together, so synergy. And Swahili is one of the most widely spoken indigenous languages in Africa. And it so happens that Harambee is the motto of Kenya. And after the two financial powerhouses of Nigeria and South Africa, Kenya I regard as the most innovative country in Africa. So I thought it was appropriate to use a word that talks about the optimistic, cooperative, and collaborative nature of innovation in Africa, and uses the motto of Kenya. And just for interest, I think the most innovative state in the USA is California, and their motto is Eureka, also to do with discovery.
Thanks, Mike. So your cover, and we can see the book here, and I've got a copy of the book a week ago. It has an intriguing photograph of an off-road vehicle. What persuaded you to choose that particular image for your cover?
Right, well, I hasten to add that I know virtually nothing about motor cars. Once when I lived in Grahamstown, I bought a car in Port Elizabeth, drove it to my home, and the next morning I had to reverse it out the drive, and I couldn't find reverse. I had to phone my petrol-head brother in Pietermaritzburg to ask him how to engage reverse. But this is the turtle truck. And unfortunately, there's a bit of a glitch because the caption for this image was supposed to be on the subtitle page of the book, but it's not there, so people have to read the book to find out about it. Now, what happened was two young men from the Netherlands, one an artist and the other a sociologist, they visited Ghana on an assignment to study the informal sector there, and in particular to study a place called the Sawami Magazine, which is probably the world's largest car parts scrapyard. There are over 200,000 small businesses there, and 200,000 people and 12,000 small businesses selling car parts. And these two chaps saw the potential for building functional vehicles out of these car parts. So they formed an NGO, which turned out to be very successful, and they worked with these scrapyard people, and they are actually building cars that work from these various parts. Now, it's probably the lowest tech car in the world, an example of sort of disnovation, as it's called. And it reminded me a bit of Johnny Cash's famous song, 1976, I think, One Piece at a Time, about the psychobilly Cadillac, that this chap who worked for Cadillac used to steal one piece every day, and then he built a car out of it over a period of years. So to me, it's symbolic of the sort of can-do, informal, do as you like, break the rules kind of innovation that characterizes Africa.
You've said that the idea for this particular book had its origins 20 years ago in an exhibition entitled, I quote, "Inventions That Changed the World," and then you mounted it here in Cape Town. What was the enlightening comment that the NRF president, Dr. Khotso Mogele, said to you at that event all those years ago that inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, we did this exhibition at the then MTN Science Center on inventions that changed the world. We featured the 100 greatest inventions of all time. And Dr. Mogele came along, and I showed him around the exhibition. He said, "Mike, why don't you do one on South African inventions?" And I said, "Oh, we've got some South African inventions in the corner there." We had about 10. That's all I knew about at the time. You know, the typical thing, the Dolos and the Creepy Crawly and Milo and stuff like that. But after we'd completed that exhibition, I decided to go into this and did research, and a few years later we mounted an exhibition called Great South African Inventions. And that was hugely successful. It traveled around the country for years, and in fact it was updated 3 times, and it's still in existence and is owned by the SASTA, the South African Agency for Science and Technology Advancement. And they still travel it around South Africa, and parts of it have even been to Japan and China. So that's what kicked it off. And after that, I started to get communications from inventors elsewhere in Africa. And, like many people, it was a bit of a blank page for me. I didn't really know what had been invented elsewhere in Africa, but I was blown away by this information that started to pour in. And especially when I did radio interviews that went out into the rest of Africa. So the information started coming in, and I hasten to add, as Kit mentioned, I'm qualified as a fish scientist, so I'm totally unqualified to write about innovation. But I developed the interest, and it's like looking at an abstract artwork of a famous artist and thinking, I could have done that, but the point is you didn't. And in this case, I decided to do something that I probably a little bit silly to take on, and it's just developed over the years, and now I'm trying to talk about the whole of Africa.
So many books about Africa tend to be heavily weighted in favor of contributions by South Africans. But you've not fallen into that trap and appear to have gone out of your way to find examples of innovation in all the countries of Africa. How difficult was it to track down and document all those stories?
Well, firstly, I'd like to point out that the Harambee book really needs to be read in conjunction with my previous book called What a Great Idea, Awesome South African Inventions, which covers about 700 inventions and innovations by 400 plus inventors. And I say in the preface to the Harambee book that I've deliberately not repeated what I wrote in the Great Idea book, except where an invention has had a big impact elsewhere in Africa. Then I embellish a little bit on that. As to finding the information, well, this was written during COVID, so travel was extremely restricted. But fortunately, the email exists, and I just got into very heavy email correspondence with innovators and inventors and policymakers and scientists and discoverers all over Africa. And it was quite a lot of work. I had the good fortune to visit a few African countries during that time, Botswana and Ghana and Tanzania and the Comores and Kenya and Egypt and so on. But most of it was by correspondence.
And when you sat down and made your notes and so on, are you one of those people who types directly into the computer, or do you write things out longhand and then put all of it together?
No, I don't do it longhand anymore. I found the editing function on a computer extremely useful. I don't necessarily write in its final form. Quite often, I find a chapter gets too long, so I cut it up into two, or I move something from one chapter to another, but definitely straight onto the keyboard.
Okay. So you mentioned you've been to a few African countries. In fact, there are more than 50 countries in Africa. So over your career, how many of those countries have you actually visited? And follow-up question, what country surprised you, particularly in terms of the contributions by its citizens to innovation?
Well, sadly, during the peak of my scientific career, when I was very active as a research scientist, that was the height of apartheid, and we were very restricted in terms of the African countries we could visit. So I estimate I've only visited about 22 African countries, so less than half, which is a great pity. I'd love to visit more of them. Those that impressed me most in terms of innovation is firstly, Egypt on a different level in terms of historic pre-colonial inventions. Just about everything that was invented in Africa was invented first in Egypt. I'm talking about simple things to do with fishing and agriculture and food growing and architecture, shipbuilding, etc. It's quite remarkable how early some inventions took place there. But in the modern era, I'm really impressed with Ghana and Kenya, and then also Ethiopia, which I haven't managed to visit, but I've got contacts there and I've read a lot about it.
Okay.
And I think inventions and innovations from 50 countries are mentioned in the book.
So many people will be familiar with the Latin phrase, ex semper aliquid novae. Who has heard of that expression?
Ex-Africa. Yeah.
Ex-Africa semper aliquid novae. Anybody? Okay, now Professor Vaughan is now going to ask you, do you know what it means?
Something new out of Africa,
yeah,
always.
Exactly. Always something new out of Africa. Thank you. So, Mike, now I'm going to put you on the spot. Who's credited with this particular phrase? And explain how it resonates with the stories in your book.
Okay, it's attributed to Pliny the Elder, who is a Roman scholar, author, and what they called natural philosopher in those days, a scientist. And he was actually referring to mammals when he first coined it. And yes, it very much applies to this book. And one of the reasons I wrote it is because when I talk to people about African innovation, I had dinner with some people the other day, and I mentioned to a gentleman there, I said, I've written this book about African innovation. He said, oh, it must be a very slim volume. And it's so untrue. I had a word number restriction on this. I could have written a book 3 times bigger than this based on the information I have. It's quite astonishing how many innovations have come out of Africa and continue to come. I reckon I've got 300 on my books that I've been informed of since I completed this manuscript. So yes, that definitely applies to Africa.
Yes.
Are they all physical innovations, or are they sort of ideas like democracy, for example, which was created in Greece? I don't know. Are they those kind of innovations?
Okay, I didn't include democracy as an African invention. Maybe I should have. But I have taken a very broad view of what innovation is. So, I'm not just talking about technology and mechanics and industrialization. I include clothing, I include architecture, city design, etc. My one regret is that I had drafted a chapter on creativity and innovation in the arts, including the performing arts, but it would have made the book too big. So I actually included it in this book. So I haven't lost it. But yeah, it depends on how broadly one defines innovation. But it's extraordinary how much started in Africa. I mean, we rightly called the cradle of humankind. I think the continent could also be called the crucible of innovation.
So just to pick up on that point about people looking down their nose at things from Africa, in the beginning of chapter 1, you quote the paleoanthropologist Professor Philip Tobias, who said, and I quote, "What has Africa given to the world?" People often ask in a sneering and derogatory way, as if they already know the answer. Nothing. But Africa has given the world humanity, and that is no small thing. And secondly, it has given the world the first human culture, and that is also not a small thing. You then go on to describe some of the pre-colonial inventions that were made in Africa. Which of those do you find remarkable?
Well, I think Professor Hinchelman and his students' finding in Blombos Cave are quite phenomenal. The so-called first chemistry set, which is a perlmutt shell with ochre and animal fat and other stuff mixed in it. Some human, 100,000 years ago, was mixing chemicals for some use. We're not sure what. It might have been a suntan lotion, or to color the skin, or for tanning leather. But it shows, abstract thinking, the ability to multitask and produce something from a combination of materials. Also, the ochre artifact they found there with symmetrical scratches on it, which is regarded as the earliest abstract artwork. And then elsewhere, in Border Cave, the lunar stick, which is the oldest known mathematical device. In Classes River Cave, beautiful bone arrowheads. And this is right at the... All of these are tens of thousands of years earlier than similar ones found elsewhere in the world. So it really is remarkable. And then more recently, the gold plating of the golden rhino of Mapungubwe, the traditional fishing methods that have been developed in Africa, and which in fact are teaching us very valuable lessons now on how to sustainably harvest aquatic resources rather than kill them off, as we tend to do with efficient modern gear. So, some of those early inventions are now coming back into vogue and are being promoted.
So drought is one of the great challenges facing farmers, particularly here in Africa. I was intrigued by the story of Matoni Masinde from Kenya. She invented the drought predictor, which combines indigenous knowledge and modern information technology. What can we learn from her story?
Well, Dr. Masindi grew up in a rural area in Kenya. Her father and all her uncles were farmers. And she noticed that they were making predictions as to whether droughts would occur and other weather events by using indigenous knowledge, in other words, observations of nature around them, when birds and insects migrated, the number of mammals of different kinds that they saw, when flowers bloomed, etc. And while she appreciated the value of that indigenous knowledge type of prediction, she realized it wasn't as accurate as they needed it to be. So she started to study ways in which the indigenous knowledge could be enhanced by modern meteorological data. And she created the Itiki Drought Predictor, which is an app and a website which makes it possible for farmers to integrate their own indigenous knowledge with knowledge from modern meteorological measurements and predict not only droughts, but harvesting times and pruning times and when to pick the fruit, etc. And she subsequently did a PhD at UCT, and she's now at the Central University of Technology in the Free State, and was the first woman to receive the National Science and Innovation Award on Research and Innovation.
One of the world's favorite drinks is coffee, and that came out of Africa. Which country is credited with this drink? And tell us about the legend of the young goat herder.
Well, coffee originated in Abyssinia, now Ethiopia, in the high altitude regions there, and there's a province called Kaffa, K-A-F-F-A, which is where coffee originated and where most of it comes from. And I think about 85% of the exports of Ethiopia in terms of value is coffee, so it's a major export. And by the way, their top soccer team is called Ethiopian Coffee. That's how important it is. But the story is that a young goat herd, I think his name was Kilda, noticed that when his goats ate a particular berry, they became invigorated and jumped around. So like any good innovator, he gobbled up some of the berries himself, and he found that they gave him energy and kept him awake and so on. And the local scholarly people were monks. So he took some of these berries along to the monks, and they tried them, and they found they were very useful to, sort of keep awake during their long vigils and so on. And apparently that's how it developed, and coffee was subsequently exported to Yemen and the Middle East, and then it went into Europe and eventually in Western Europe. And yeah, it's the most popular drink, I believe. 2.5 million cups are drunk a day, or is it 2.5 billion? It could be.
So another drink that has become particularly popular over the past few years is gin. And one of the new gins you describe is called Ndlovu, which I understand means elephant in several African languages. Tell us about the origins of this particular gin.
Right, well, just to mention first that Cape Town is arguably the craft gin capital of the world. There are at least 80 craft gins being produced on a commercial basis here. Quite phenomenal. The story of Ndlovu gin started with a young biologist called Paula Ansley, who went with her husband on a trip to a game reserve where they saw elephants. And she said to him after the trip, "Why don't we make gin out of elephant dung?" Because they had been told that elephants browse on a wide variety of botanicals, plants. They eat the fruit, the leaves, the bark, the roots, of over 100 species of plants, but they only digest about half of that. So in their dung, there's a residue of lots of plant material. And they figured that they could flavor and color their gin using the botanicals from elephant dung. And they consulted the experts, and they produced a gin, and its motto is "Made in South Africa, designed by elephants." And it's been very popular.
So another topic. Almost 50,000 people in sub-Saharan Africa die from snake bites every year, and another 400,000 survive with amputated limbs and other permanent disabilities. Tell us about Balde Selu, the biologist from Guinea, who has made an astonishing contribution to the treatment of snake bites.
Selu originally trained as an entomologist studying insects, and he was working at a remote research station. And one day a young girl who had been bitten by a snake was brought to him, and he realized that he had no way to save her, and she actually died in his arms. And at that moment, he decided he was going to move from entomology to study snake venoms and figure out how to solve this problem, not only in Guinea, but elsewhere in Africa. So he worked with a number of companies, French and other companies, and they developed an antivenom that was eventually effective against 18 different species of snakes. Because quite often, when the victim comes into a clinic or hospital, they don't know what snake bit you. So they need this sort of generic one, and that has been developed and has been very successfully distributed and used. And I should mention in South Africa we have a snake whisperer, a chap who is conserving the gaboon adder, which is a very venomous snake, lives up in northern Zululand in the dune forests and near Matuba, and occurs in 20 other African countries, an iconic African animal. And they are severely threatened, and he's studied the behavior of them, and he's figured out exactly where to find them, how to catch them, and then he releases them in protected areas. And elsewhere in Africa, there are elephant whisperers and even locust whisperers.
Is there a fish whisperer?
I'm trying.
When people are asked to name the world's oldest degree-granting institution, they often mention Bologna in Italy, which was founded in 1088, or Cambridge in England, which was founded in 1209. The University of Cape Town, which was founded in 1829, is the oldest institution in South Africa. Which African university is recognized as the oldest degree-granting institution in the world? And tell us about the person who founded this institution.
Okay, all those universities you mentioned are mere piccaninnies compared with this one that I'm going to mention. It was founded by a woman, Fatima Al-Fahiri, who inherited a fortune from her father, who was a rich merchant, and she spent it wisely, initially building a mosque, and then a madrasa, which is a school associated with a mosque, and that developed into a college and a university, which is still going today. And if I remember correctly, it was opened in 895. And there are two other universities in Africa, one in Cairo, where Ibn al-Haytham studied, and another in Timbuktu, which also precede 1000 CE. So, those are much older than the ones in Europe.
One of the great success stories coming out of Africa in the field of fintech, that's shorthand for financial technology, is Cellulant, which was founded by two young Nigerians. What impact has this company had on agriculture in our continent?
Okay, Cellulant, as Kit mentioned, started by two young Nigerians, and like a lot of innovations, the initial idea for it was sketched out on a napkin while they're having a meal in a restaurant. Nigeria, regrettably, is a country racked with corruption. And they both had farming relatives, and they realized that although Nigeria had a very generous scheme of making loans to farmers and startup funds and venture capital and so on, very little of this money actually reached the farmer because it was stolen along the way by intermediary agencies. So they created an app which put the farmer directly in touch with the granting agency with no intermediaries and no bureaucracy associated with it. And the farmer didn't have to have a bank account. He didn't have to have collateral to guarantee anything. He could just, sign up. And that's been so successful. I think it's now operating in 33 African countries. So it's a wonderfully successful startup. They now are doing the same with venture capital coming from investors in the agricultural sector. And from our last communication with them, they're about to disrupt the highly corrupt energy sector in Nigeria, where people can buy energy on their smartphones, but there's a lot of corruption along the way. So I think they're a great example of the can-do spirit of African innovation.
So also in the tech field, we've heard of and probably used the world's first computerized ticketing system called CompuTicket. And that was introduced, I didn't know this until I read it in the book, over 50 years ago, 1971. Tell us about its inventor, Percy Tucker.
Yeah, Percy is a dear old man, sadly died earlier this year, but I had a lot of interaction with him, and he agreed to talk at many of the events that we had for my various books on innovation. He called himself a placer of posterior placements. In other words, a ticket seller for people attending the theatre. And he was incredibly frustrated when trying to encourage patrons from attending theatre performances of the long queues and not knowing whether they're going to get in or not. And at the time, the airlines were the only organizations that were using computers for ticketing. And he liaised with them and with banks and created the first online ticketing system in the world. In fact, it was so far ahead of its time that it was 18 years before another one was developed in the Northern Hemisphere. And CompuTicket is still a leader in the world in terms of technology upgrades, etc., and is used throughout Africa.
Drones have become ubiquitous over the last few years, and I was particularly impressed by the story of Ruben Pillay from Mauritius. In fact, I tracked down his website to see what he'd created with his drone and his high-resolution camera. Explain to us this young man's impressive accomplishment.
Okay, drones feature quite strongly in my book, and in fact, one of the most advanced drone companies in the world is based in Cape Town, Aerobotics. They're doing remarkable stuff, not just photographing farms or orchards. They photograph individual trees and the leaves on trees through their drones to determine their health and the moisture levels, etc. But Ruben Pillay, he was sort of locked down during COVID and looking for something useful to do. And because Mauritius isn't on Google Street Map, he decided to do a 3D map of the whole of Mauritius. And using a drone, he methodically photographed the entire island with overlapping fields and created something where you can not only get a bird's eye view or satellite eye view of Mauritius, but you can click on one of his photo locations, and you can then look through 360 degrees from that point at what Mauritius looks like from that particular point. So it was a wonderful innovation that he developed. And of course, drones are robots, and I talk a lot about robots and robotics, and it's amazing how COVID and enforcing the lockdown and curfews promoted the development of robots in Africa. The Tygerberg Hospital had some robots roaming its wards, but in particular in Tunisia, a company there, very advanced company, developed a robotic policeman that would patrol the streets and ask people for proof, that they could break the curfew if they were wandering around. And yeah, they're wonderful examples. And there's a zipline robot that was delivering urgent medical supplies, and wildlife conservation, mapping the distribution of endangered animals, very, very important.
We're wrapping it up here. In your final chapter, you refer to the various eras, pre-industrial, industrial, and post-industrial. Why do you make this distinction? And what do you think are the implications for the future, particularly here in Africa?
Well, Kit, you were also educated Rhodes, and one of the things we were taught there is don't believe anything, question everything, especially if it's by a world authority. And I'm just a retired fisherman, but this fellow who proposed that we're now in the fourth industrial revolution, Klaus Schwab, he's an internationally known economist. He started the World Economic Forum, and, presidents sort of bow in front of him. But I don't agree with him. I think he's wrong. I think this is not just another industrial revolution. The first three industrial revolutions were similar in that they promoted industrialization, although we moved, from steam to electricity to nuclear and alternative energy. But basically, they promoted the Western view of what civilization is, which is, continue to produce lifestyles and goods and services which are extremely harmful to the environment. The first three industrial revolutions greatly improved the quality of life of humans, but they greatly unimproved the quality of life of all the other inhabitants of the planet. And, I remind ourselves in there that nature has a habit and, in fact, a mechanism of kicking out unfit organisms which don't fit into the system. So we better watch our step. But I argue that this fourth industrial revolution, or that this is the first post-industrial revolution, because it's not characterized by smoke billowing from chimneys and, moneyed, middle-class white men creating industries. It's characterized by gig economies, lots of little economies of young people, male and female, from the developed and the undeveloped world, doing their thing and addressing problems. And I argue that the tools that this post-industrial revolution has provided us with allow us to undo many of the wrongs, the harm caused by those first three industrial revolutions. And, because of the internet, the power of the human brain, the Internet of Things, now the Internet of Industrial Things, we've created a kind of connected, multi-brain, multi-generational organism that I think, properly applied, has the ability to address all these problems that we've created. And we have created very serious problems which threaten the livelihood, of many species. And conservationists tend to move away from conserving what we call charismatic mega herbivores, rhinos and elephants, to conserving essential life support processes and essential ecological processes that support all life forms, whether in game reserves or not in game reserve. And the relevance to Africa is that Africa is beautifully placed to be a major contributor to the post-industrial revolution, because our young people are innovative, they've got a lot of energy, they're highly connected, and they are on the ground. They are aware of the issues and what needs to be solved. And I think the one thing this book shows is how relevant the innovations of African people are to reversing the harm done by those first three industrial revolutions. And just, if I could also say that this thinking must be combined with what we call the Anthropocene extinction event. This is the sixth big extinction event that's occurred in the history of life. Over the last 3.8 million years, 6 big extinction events, and one is happening right now, and it's the first one to be caused by a living thing, and that's us. I saw on CNN last night, 1/5 of all reptile species are due to go extinct within the next few decades. And that's a frightening statistic and applies to so many other organisms. So, we're grappling with big issues, and we've got to bring to bear the new technologies and the hyperconnectivity of this post-industrial era. So, Uncle Klaus is wrong.
So I'd like to finish off by asking anybody in the audience who'd like to pose a question to Mike, either about the book or about anything. Yes, please, go ahead.
I have a question. So you cite 800 innovations in your book, if I'm not mistaken, and they're all originating in Africa. Are these only or mostly applicable to Africa or limited to Africa, or are they true and relevant globally, meaning being the first time they've been invented globally? And if the latter, how did you go about verifying that they truly have never been invented anywhere else?
Yeah, I'm talking about inventions made in Africa, but that doesn't mean they're not applied and used elsewhere. Many of them are. And, verifying that they were the first, that is a long-term process. You've got to be very meticulous about that. I mean, there are patents and so on that one can refer to. But, I did lots of multiple cross-checking to be sure of my facts. But then again, some inventions are invented several times in different places, and people don't know of one another, and then they eventually get to know one another. So, one just has to report what you know. And I think where I say that's a new invention, I mean, M-Pesa, for instance, the money system that you can exchange money with your smartphone, even if you haven't got a bank account, invented by Safaricom in Kenya, that's internationally regarded as the pioneer, of money transfer by smartphone. Everyone acknowledges that. And so, one just has to check facts very carefully.
Anybody else? If not, I'd like to thank Mike very much indeed for a thoroughly entertaining exposition about some of the things, the stories in this book. I've not read every single page in the last week, but I've dipped into it, and that's, I think, how you can go and look at a chapter on science, or you can look at it, well, not science, but space, or as Mike indicated, there's a chapter on robotics and so on. So I hope that many of you will buy the book and get Mike to sign it afterwards. So I believe there are still a few drinks there at the back. But thank you very much to everybody for attending, and thank you, Mike, again.
Thank you very much, Kit.